So welcome everyone. I think it's a good time for us to get started. Although we have some folks who will still be trickling in, I do want to share that in the chat, Allison has mentioned that we do have closed captioning for this event. So if you'd like to utilize that feature, please click on the CC live transcript button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And to get us started, welcome, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us to the third and final installment of our anti-racism toolkit programming, Transforming Knowledge to Action. Today's or this week's topic is on healing justice and the possibilities of liberation. Dr. Carlton Green is not able to join us this week. So this event will be moderated and I guess partially emceed rather by myself, Jasmine Pichaldo, pronouns she, her, ella, Assistant Director of Diversity Training and Education, and my wonderful colleague, Brian Medina. Brian, can you please take a moment to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you all. Brian Medina, pronouns are Z, here, and here's, and I am the program manager for Bias Incident Support Services here at the University of Maryland. Thank you, and grateful to be with you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Today's program is a special partnership and collaboration between ODI, Diversity Training and Education, and BIS, Bias Incident Student Support Services. We are excited to have some wonderful guests and speakers with us who are going to share some brilliant wisdom and insight for our community as we continue to move forward in our work towards embodying and living anti-racist action and practice. And so I'll give it to you, Brian, to take it away.
Thank you again, Jasmine. So as we get started, we want to acknowledge the land in which at least the University of Maryland College Park sits. Many of you may be joining virtually, could be from all over the United States or all over the world. But we wanted to read this and then share a little bit of thoughts around it. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to migrate from their homes in hope of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. At the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, we believe it's important to create dialogue to honor those that have been historically and systematically disenfranchised. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We're on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway Conoy people, who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We're on indigenous land that was stolen from Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to Piscataway elders and ancestors, and we ask that you please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here together today. So as you pause and think through wherever it is that the ancestors and the space and the land that you are, let's also acknowledge that land acknowledgements are not enough, that we need to move beyond a performative gesture, but more in relationship and honoring those indigenous ancestors in our communities, building relationships with them directly, also honoring our land and our water in all of our various ways. In order for us to also state for our universities, especially those of us in higher education, we're land grant universities, we're also granted land grab for us to then cultivate the land, but in order for us to be benefited and not those for our ancestry. So I just named that. I also want us to be in the moment, acknowledging that we are in a space in the midst of a pandemic, multiple pandemics, and that just this week, we learned of another killing of a Black life by the hands of police. Dante Wright, who was just having a routine traffic stop, was murdered and killed very near where George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Right now, we're also experiencing the Derek Chauvin trial. And so I just named that the pain and trauma that we're experiencing here in this moment perhaps can cause ripple effects, continued challenges for folks in this session, but even beyond for those seeing this recording, how we continue to see the violence against Black and Brown and Indigenous communities around the United States and beyond.
Thank you, Brian. And I want to encourage folks to please utilize the resources on our campus for support, to reach out to our counseling center. I believe there are a few healing spaces going on campus as well, um, that will also be announced in our weekly newsletter through the Diverse Terps newsletter. Um, as we move forward, um, we want to take a moment and ground this program in the ways that we've been grounding it since its inception last summer, with a working definition of racism that is offered to us by Dr. Kamara Jones, who's past president of the American Public Health Association. Um, that racism is a system. It is not a personal moral failing. It isn't even a psychiatric illness. It's a system of power, and it's a system of doing two things: of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And it does those things based upon so-called race, based on the social interpretation of how we look. Um, we keep coming back to this working definition because of its groundedness, because of what it offers us in terms of understanding what racism looks like, both systemically, structurally, but even interpersonally and in our individual lives. And we get to the source of what inspired this program, right? Which is a turn towards anti-racism and anti-racist action in particular, that it isn't simply an ideology or a belief or a theory, but that it is an embodied practice. And so I want to offer the definition of anti-racism we've been working with as well. That anti-racism is a behavior. It is pursuing racial justice by naming, understanding, being accountable for, and providing remedies for the system of racial stratification that structures opportunity and assigns value. That this is work, an ongoing work that we do on our campus, that it requires some courage and deep self-reflection, and that today's program is really going to get us to engage not only on the intellectual parts of what it means to be anti-racist, what it means to pursue liberation, but also the emotional, the psychological, the spiritual. How do we bring our wholeness and our full self on our journey towards liberation? And so I start today with grounding us in a definition of healing justice that was shared with me through a webinar experience with one of our panelists, Erica Woodland, and his colleague, Kara Page, in the Healing Justice, a Political Strategy for Movements. In this training, they shared that healing justice was conceived by the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. Healing justice is a political strategy to intervene on generational trauma from systemic oppression, policing, and violence by building community, survivor-led responses rooted in ancestral medicine, and are building new traditions that center our psychic, emotional, physical, mental, spiritual, and environmental well-being for our collective liberation. I want us to sit with this definition for a moment and think about what is key to this definition of healing justice, which is a recognition that oppression is a trauma that we have inherited that harms all of us, including those who benefit from our current systems. It recognizes that oppression is not only the physical violence we see and endure that we've seen in the past weeks and months and years, but it's also what we don't see. It's the psychological, emotional, spiritual violence against our humanity. We see it every day in the news, in the violence of the lives taken, and also in the ways of life taken, in the ways that Indigenous land is being repossessed and dispossessed. What we often don't see or choose to minimize is the communal grief that accompanies this loss, and that this collective harm is exacerbated when we return to organizations and workspaces that don't acknowledge the loss, that reproduce the very systems we're trying to break, that continually remind us of our own traumas, expose us to secondary PTSD, and where we then feel guilty or punished for leaving work early to prioritize our well-being. As our other panelist, Mayan Padamsi, wrote in her piece, Communities of Care, Organizations of Liberation, which was one of the articles in our anti-racism curriculum. And so as I name this, I also need to name that what we've been saying and sharing with our community is that white people are also harmed by systemic racism because it creates a warped sense of what it means to be human and normalizes the violence that is inflicted on minoritized groups and the violence they inflict on each other in order to maintain our current systems as a necessary condition of their humanity. And I say that quite deliberately and intentionally to invite us to think about the ways that we have constructed what it means to be human, what it means to be humane, and who is centered in those conversations and definitions, and how folks of color have never been at the center of that. So healing justice calls on us to recognize our interconnectedness, to listen and to be led by folks who are closest to the pain, and to work together towards our liberation. And so with that, I transition to introducing our panelists at the proper bio.
Thank you so much again, Jasmine. So we have two amazing panelists and also a lovely moderator I can call my supervisor. I'll read their bios quickly. They're also on the screen for you. So Erica Woodland is a Black, queer, genderqueer facilitator, consultant, and healing justice practitioner born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. He is also a licensed clinical social worker who has done extensive work in prisons, jails, group homes, psychiatric facilities, schools, nonprofit organizations, community-based clinics, and grassroots groups, giving him a wide range of experience to draw from in his practice. From 2012 to 2016, Erica served as the field building director for the Brown Boy Project and currently serves as the executive director of the National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network. Yashna Mayan Padamsi is a first-gen South Asian immigrant queer femme raised in and by the US South. She has over 15 years of experience supporting social movements by creating innovative infrastructure and sharing liberatory healing practices. In the last decade, she has served as a program manager at Generative Somatics and as the events director in the at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Yashna is currently director of operations at Press On, a Southern media collective, and is co-founder and moderator of Rad Ops, a justice-based group for operations workers and movements organizations. Dr. Van Bailey is a student affairs educator, international speaker, and diversity consultant with over 13 years of experience in higher education and nonprofits. Van has given speeches and workshops related to LGBTQ+ student leadership, pedagogical practice, and intersectionality. In 2014, he was included in the Trans 100, and in 2015, he was also included in the 100 to Watch LGBTQ SGL Emerging Leaders. Dr. Bailey is a Lambda Literary Award finalist, and his published work has been featured on NPR, the Boston Globe, Huffington Post, Feminist Wire, and BuzzFeed. And happy to also introduce my supervisor, the Director of Biosense and Support Services.
Hello, everyone. Very excited to be in community with you all, to be moderating this very important conversation where we are going to be talking about healing justice. But when talking about healing justice, we have to talk about trauma. We have to talk about harm. We have to talk about violence. We have to talk about systems and power. And most importantly, in all of that, we have to talk about action. And so I am going to invite our panelists who are going to ground us in some very important content and knowledge for us to be in community around same language and learnings. And so I am going to first invite Yashna to give us a presentation grounded in her work around healing justice.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Bailey, and thank you for the warm welcome and introductions. I'm really happy to be here. So I did have a slideshow prepared for y'all, but I'm going to lean into Southern traditions and just go into some storytelling for a little while, and may or may not use the slideshow. But I'm so glad that communities of care, organizations for liberation is part of your toolkit. I feel honored by that. now the essay is 10 years old. I wrote it back in 2011. We're in 2021 right now. And it's in curriculums and toolkits all over the country and maybe world at this point. And it's beautiful that it still has resonance, and it also is upsetting that 10 years later it still has resonance, right? But I do think a lot has happened and changed since the writing of that piece. But I wanted to take you back into my life a little bit, even maybe even like 6 years before I wrote the piece. So back in 2005, I was working at a local nonprofit in Durham, North Carolina, giving my blood, sweat, and tears to this local org that I loved so much. And in the evenings, I was going to member meetings with Song Southerners on New Ground and Ubuntu, which is a women of color and survivor-led collective fighting against rape culture. And um, and then on the weekends, I was teaching yoga to my community. And these parts of my life were all very separate. My political and politicized work was in the evenings, my healing work was on the weekends, and my organizational work was during the work week, right? And it was all very compartmentalized and separated. And what came from that very quickly was burnout. And I wasn't the only one. I was noticing that in organizations and organizers around me. And another thing that came from that was in my political work, I was also finding that I was getting more uh, progressive healing through my political work than I had in years of therapy and years of healing modalities. Um, I was finding that uh, being a survivor of sexual assault myself, doing organizing and political work, um, and it being rooted in community and rooted in a collective power, um, that my healing was happening in that realm of political work. So these two things were happening at the same time: this burnout as well as this healing. Um, which is interesting and contradictory, but it happens, right? So through that burnout, I spent the next few years finding ways to recover. I didn't want to drop out of movement work. I wanted to stay engaged. And as I said, I was finding that this was happening to many people around me as well. A few years later, I was very blessed to have worked with the Kindred Healing Justice Collective that Kara Page was also a part of founding, and helped design the Healing Justice track and space at the US Social Forum in 2010. And there I was learning a lot about transformative organizations and how healing justice and movement work could actually go hand in hand. This is where now I might share my screen and go into some of the slides. So here we go. All right. Can y'all see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Of course. So I wanted to return us back to this this definition that y'all started with, which is that healing justice is a political strategy. I really love that it's rooted in this, that it's a political strategy, and that it's a framework for movements to address collective harm and trauma. So it's not this add-on piece, but that it is a framework for us to use to bring into all of our work. and that it's also rooted in Southern traditions of resiliency and sustaining. So it's a way that we can transform and sustain our work in the movement. And that healing, when asked like why healing, why do we need to heal? Yes, it's for our individual selves. Yes, it was for my individual self, for my burnout, for my previous trauma. And it's as we're individually healing, we are part of a collective, we're part of a community, we're not separate from it. And so it's really about towards a collective liberation and towards sustainable movements, not one at the expense of the other, not that we need to put ourselves on the line at the expense, put to forward movements, we need to put ourselves on the line, but that we are putting ourselves on the line for our own individual liberation as well as our collective liberation. Some of the values that I want to lift up from Kindred Healing Justice Collective are listed here. There's too much to get into right here and now, but I wanted to show these values and how it also echoes with the values of the 10 principles of disability justice, and that there's a lot of similarities between the two. In terms of finding interdependence, collective access, valuing all bodies, and intersectionality. So this is a long line, a long legacy of work that has has long history. And even in these last 10, 15, 20 years, we are seeing it now named in our movements and really lifted up and valued in new ways. Stop sharing for a moment, going back to some storytelling. So one thing that I wanted to highlight is that my piece, Communities of Care, Organizations for Liberation, really focuses in on how our organizations and institutions can, it was a call to shift the framework within our organizations. So we're out here trying to change the world, trying to change structures of the world, while still being within structures like the nonprofit industrial complex, like university systems, whatever your organization is. We're still in these organizations that were built through these old values, right? And so we can think about healing at these different levels, whether it's this individual healing or collective and structural healing and transformation through organizing. And I wanted the article to focus on organizations and how our institutions can be called to action to also be a site of transformation and change. I'm just checking the time. I'll just end with this story as an example. So as was mentioned in my bio, I worked with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. We had an immigrant justice campaign called We Belong Together. And We Belong Together in 2015 had a 100 women, 100 miles pilgrimage from a detention center in Pennsylvania all the way to Washington, D.C., where 100 to 150 women, immigrant women, migrant women, undocumented folks, their children, their allies, we all walked together from this detention center to D.C. to uplift migrant justice. I was part of helping design that pilgrimage. And what we did was build in a healing justice framework into that pilgrimage. So each morning we started with wellness practices, we started with somatic centering, um, some folks led prayers, and we did different rituals to ground us in why we were doing this movement work, literal movement work of the pilgrimage, um, and ground us in our values together. And then we had wellness checkpoints throughout the pilgrimage. So that was one way that healing and wellness was integrated into an institutional setting. Um, but that it was really, again, it was really integrated and not a separate thing, but woven into this campaign and to this work. Um, there's so much more to say. I fear that I am at time, um, but what I what I want to close with is that there's multiple words now that we're using to highlight the work of healing justice, what we've been seeing through this pandemic, and the lifting up of mutual aid, again, isn't a new concept. It's what our communities have been doing a long time, but mutual aid is another form of community care, right? It's how we take care of each other and how we find and recreate our own structures and organizations towards change. So thank you for the time, and I'm looking forward to diving in a little bit deeper with y'all.
Thank you so much, Yasha. That was amazing, and really appreciate all that you shared. You know, especially honing in on this piece around it not being an add-on, healing justice, not being an add-on, but being a framework for doing this work around how we can hold both of the contradictions around burnout as well as healing and doing those things at the same time. And the really important aspect of collective power and liberation in order to build sustainable movements. Thank you so much for sharing. We're going to definitely, engage more in these conversations, but I'm going to invite Erica to impart some wisdom on us and share a little bit more knowledge and content as it relates to healing justice. Erica, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bailey. Thank you, Yashna, for that just beautiful context setting. I think one of my biggest learnings around healing justice is how important the context and conditions are to these conversations. So I just want to start off by naming kind of how I entered the lineage of healing justice, because I feel like it's really important. Because healing justice is rooted in a number of movements and movement frameworks, we all have different entry points, and my entry point is through harm reduction. And so in the early 2000s, I was doing work with criminalized survivors, folks who were engaged in the drug economy, sex trade, folks who were cycling in and out of jails and prisons in Baltimore and the state of Maryland, and primarily working with Black folks who were not only navigating state violence, but also community violence and intergenerational trauma. And so as an outreach worker, as a case manager, as someone who was, on the streets of Baltimore, really engaging with folks around health and healing, I really just want to name and acknowledge all of the folks in my community here who really poured into me to help me hone in around what my political commitment has been to this conversation around healing justice and organizing and building power. So I have a few slides, and I'm so happy Yashna went first because there's just so much framing that I get to move into. Before I share my slides, I want to just name the moment that we're in around healing justice, because I feel like it's really important. There is so much hunger. There is so much excitement around healing justice as a framework. And I think that, our communities have really been longing for this for a long time. And at the same time, as with any kind of new thing, there's also a trendiness and a sexiness that's being attached to healing justice that actually is divorcing it from the history and lineage and divorcing it from the set of political values that we actually got from organizers in the Southeast, as Yashna beautifully laid out. And so a lot of where I'm going to start with my presentation is just remembering and regrounding us inside of the communities, the movements, and the acts of resistance and liberation that got us to this moment, and to really move us away from the commodification of healing justice. I feel really strongly about that because I'm seeing some really bizarre things happening in the name of healing justice that are actually not going to get us where we need to be. All right. So one of my favorite things about healing justice is that when I came into the framework, I spent all this time just feeling like, wow, where was this when I was being politicized? Where was this when I was exploring what my unique contribution is as a healer? And the more that I rooted down into the history and some of the pieces of the history that have been invisibilized, it really became apparent that the language of healing justice and the concept as we're currently engaging with it is relatively new, right? But what we know is that our people, specifically people of color and all marginalized peoples across the globe, have required strategies around care and protection for our liberation. And so what I want to just highlight with this slide is that, you know, in the United States specifically, we can look at movements like the abolition of slavery and the Underground Railroad. We can look at the work of the Young Lords, specifically the takeover of the Lincoln Hospital in the name of health justice and activism. We can look at the work of the Black Panther Party, free breakfast programs, health programs, political education programs. And we can also look at the work of ACT UP and all of the activism around HIV/AIDS that really helped to shape my political understanding of this work. And I want to name these movement opportunities to remind us that, you know, if we're going to be moving towards liberation and healing justice, we have to be willing to take a certain level of risk. And if you look at these examples, all of them on some level required breaking the law and interrupting patterns and systems and legacies of harm and violence, right? And doing that really unapologetically. So sometimes when I'm feeling lost inside of what I call healing justice shenanigans, it's really helpful to remember like, oh, my people, especially being someone who's from Baltimore, like I can really root back into like, what was Harriet Tubman about in terms of helping our people to get free, right? What was Frederick Douglass up to inside of this movement to abolish slavery, right? And how were people engaging in underground and also more overt strategies to intervene around the violence and legacies of violence that were perpetuated by the state specifically. So much love and respect to Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. I so appreciate, Yashna, that you laid out the values and that you laid out some of the history. Kindred is really, really important and significant. And to me, part of kind of intervening around the healing justice shenanigans that I will talk more about later, is that we honor the work of Black and brown folks in the Southeast, and specifically women, femmes, queer and trans people, sick and disabled people who really struggled and sacrificed to bring us this framework that we're now in this political moment being able to talk about with a high level of nuance. And so I want to also honor the work of Kara Page, who's a colleague and a friend who deeply shapes and inform how I come to this conversation today. So a couple of movement spaces that have already been named that also are very pivotal to the origin of healing justice. We definitely have the US Social Forums, both in 2007 and 2010. Also Allied Media Conference is a site of really engaging with healing justice practice spaces and being a place to come together across the country to engage in what does this look like on the ground in our specific communities. And so if there's one thing that folks take away from today, it's really that healing justice comes from movement, right? It comes from movement, it comes from political organizing, and it comes from a desire to build power and to understand that healing is at the center of that power building. So as the founding director of the National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network, we have spent the past 5 years really trying to articulate our working definition of healing justice. And I'm gonna just highlight some pieces of it here because I feel like they're really important. But for us, we want to recenter not just the political aspects of healing justice, but also the spiritual aspects of healing justice, and to really understand that we're talking about political and spiritual strategy. We honor the movements and frameworks that are at the foundation of HJ, including disability justice, transformative justice, harm reduction, environmental justice, reproductive justice, and all movements for abolition. We also really know that our peoples have always had traditions and practices, right? Our ancestors knew how to heal. And although because of colonization and attempted genocide and slavery, a lot of us have been disconnected from our traditions, there is a returning and remembering of those traditions that we're inside of now. The next piece that feels really central to our definition of healing justice is that we really name historical trauma and structural violence as the root cause of our suffering. And so even if we look at harm and violence and crisis and trauma inside of our communities, we know that the legacies of historical trauma fuel further cycles of violence, even amongst ourselves, right? And so again, we want to be unapologetically honest about what we're grappling with in our communities, and to never see intra-community violence or harm, or even violence and harm inside of our families as isolated from the political and social context. For us, healing justice is also deeply rooted in our birthright to heal and our inherent ability to heal. We honor the legacy of all kinds of healing practitioners. Our network focuses on mental health practitioners, so that includes licensed therapists, but also anybody who's tending to the emotional and spiritual care of our people. But we also know that people heal in different ways, in different contexts, in different containers. And so we want to lift up the specific legacy of resilience and resistance of queer and trans people of color, right? The strategies that we've always used to survive and to make sure that our folks are taken care of. We also know that in order to move towards healing justice with integrity, we have to constantly be assessing our conditions, right? And so we do need to be in conversation regularly about, well, what does healing mean in this particular moment in this set of conditions? What is safety and what is sustainability? And that those things change over time, right? And they change based on the resources available to us. They change based on the connections and relationships that we have. And they also change based on the level of crisis, right? So what I was doing in regards to healing justice before the pandemic looks really different now, right? And the ability to really pivot and respond in the moment to what's happening is really central to building out a healing justice strategy. Just so a few more things to unearth before we move into dialogue, which I'm super excited about, is some of the core assumptions that we really want to make sure folks are grounded in, is that our trauma and suffering are political, right? Our trauma and suffering are not by accident. These things are by design, right? And I'm talking about unnecessary suffering. Being human is hard enough without the layers of structural violence, right, that we see in this country specifically. So if our trauma and suffering are political, then so is our healing, right? When you have communities that are highly traumatized, they're much easier to control. And so when you have communities that are building power and also healing, we're unstoppable. And what I'll tell you just from the kind of legacy and history of criminalization of healing practitioners, the state understands that as well. Healing justice is really about how are we going to intervene and transform intergenerational trauma, and really understanding and mapping the ways that that is alive in our movements, alive in our institutions, and playing out always unless we're intentionally addressing it. Healing justice is about collective strategy, not self-care. So again, just building upon the dope work that Yashna laid out and has been doing for decades. Self-care is really important. We definitely need people to take care of themselves. We also need to lift up and continue to build out ecosystems of community care. But because healing justice is essentially about building power, we need more than care, right? And so if you're not thinking about strategy that's building power, then maybe healing justice is not the framework that is, most aligned with what you're doing. The last piece that I'll lift up from this list is that, and another piece that often gets left out of the healing justice conversation is really an analysis and understanding and intervention around the medical industrial complex, right? So really looking at the way the medical industrial complex is also a site of harm and violence for a lot of our communities, and that we actually need to build power and build a political strategy around intervening on that system. While we know that we need folks who work inside those systems, we need folks who work outside of those systems, but that we are building out ecosystems of care for us because we can't receive care in other places, right? And to be really clear and to name that. So I'm gonna pause there. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with y'all.
Woo! So I'm going to ground us back, in a collective conversation. I'm going to invite Yashna to come back on camera, and we're going to engage in conversation with one another around some pre-populated questions we have. But Erica, thank you so much for grounding us in that important context. I took so many different gems from it. Did a lot of writing. And I want us to have a real deal conversation about what this particularly looks like in institutions of higher education, particularly at UMD, right? So in terms of context, I'm just going to keep it real. We are oftentimes in conversation in higher education around well-being and self-care. Those are the things that we typically emphasize. However, similar to what you all have shared, what is beginning to happen is this co-opting around healing justice. Similarly, what happened with intersectionality, right? We love talking about intersectionality, but oftentimes struggle with what it looks like in practice. And so I am wondering if you all can share a little bit more around the differences in healing justice for strategies, how it differs from this overall concept around wellness and well-being, and what might be challenging for people in power and institutions to get those differences. And I either one of you who want to tackle that or both, would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I want to hear you, Yashna.
Great. It's a great question. I was thinking back to the story I told earlier about the pilgrimage. And one thing that I didn't say is that we had also, it wasn't just this add-on piece that we had started each day with these wellness practices, but throughout the day, we had to do conflict resolution and mediation. We had to do political education, even during the pilgrimage. That these were all, these were all aspects and understandings of how I see healing justice, that there's these different intervention points, that what you're saying, they're not just about wellness. the wellness in this like small definition that we have it of particular healing modalities or self-care or healing for the individual, but it's healing for the collective, right? And sometimes healing for the collective comes from political education, comes from different interventions or disrupting a system, as Erica said, taking risks and really challenging the norm. That is all part of the framework of healing justice work. And I think that we're also in this moment where our language has been emboldened by campaigns like Abolish ICE and Defund the Police, that were really like, these aren't just sayings, right? But like, what does it mean to embody abolishing institutions? And so I would take that up with what we're talking about with wellness and interventions for healing justice, as well as like, what is the broadest way we can understand wellness or an intervention for wellness? So that's something. How about for you, Erica?
I love that. I think I do a lot of work with organizations and institutions that are really grappling with like, how do we get right with each other in the world that we're in? And it's been really interesting to see folks request healing justice and not be willing to look at the ways that they are harming the workers in institutions and organizations. And so, for instance, everyone has their yoga room at their org, right? Back in the olden days when we used to be able to go outside. And nobody uses it because you need to be looking at your practices. Like, how are you treating people? You can't mistreat your workers and then say self-care on top of it. And so really grappling with power, really grappling with what are the conditions in which people are doing their work, and really sitting in the contradiction around, I struggle with how much liberation we're going to get inside of systems and institutions that are connected to colonization, slavery, and attempted genocide. And it doesn't mean that we don't work in institutions. I started a healing justice organization, and we're grappling with those tensions every day, because even though we kind of started with a set of values, if you're in the nonprofit industrial complex, there's limitations to what you can do, right? And so really thinking about inside, outside strategy, and just really, managing expectations, right? Being really clear about what is the experience of folks around their well-being. If burnout is a thing that is happening to folks on your team, what is that about? And it's not about telling individual people, well, your self-care plan needs to be part of your work plan now. It's about looking at the conditions under which we do this work. And I feel really excited because I think there are more organizations grappling with this, and also being really clear that, like, healing justice, I don't think is supposed to live absorbed inside of these systems and institutions. I don't think it belongs there. And I think that there's a way healing justice can inform systems and institutions, but if it gets absorbed by them, 10 more years from now, Yashna's going to be on a panel like, why are we still talking about this thing that I wrote 20 years ago? Like, we need to move it along.
I think that's a great segue into the next question, right? Because even as we were thinking about this conversation and bringing this topic around healing justice, we were grappling with, is it even possible? Within an institution of higher education. So, how can we create organizations of care, right, around community care within uncaring institutions, right? Institutions don't quote unquote care for us. So is it even possible within an institutional context to create pathways towards healing justice, or do we have to, as you were saying, look on the outside, or maybe it's just something that informs us? What are some of your thoughts?
I think that for all of this, I think we need both the reformists and the revolutionaries. that what I mean by that in terms of organizations and institutions is that there are ways to create reform, create care within institutions in the immediate short term, medium term, long term. And I think we need the revolutionaries who are saying, let's dismantle these systems. As Erica said, these systems that are rooted in genocide, attempted genocide, colonization, they're never going to work for us. So yes, we need folks who are like, also, let's bring down the systems. But in the meantime, we have to work within these systems or learn within these systems. So I think we do also need the reformists who are doing that work. I can speak to operations work within nonprofit institutions, which I think can apply in other places as well, is that there's a whole stream of work happening in what we call rad ops or radical operations. And there's also a new emergence of worker directed nonprofits. And what I'm seeing in these two, worker self-directed nonprofits, what I'm seeing in these two areas emerging is that we're working within the structures that we have, like the 501c3 complex, nonprofit industrial complex, and finding ways to bring in care, finding ways to bring in our radical lens to apply to our workers and to apply to our working conditions. So for example, there are sick time policies where workers are banking their sick time to share with each other. So if a family member gets sick and you need to take extra sick days, or if you don't have disability insurance, these things are able to, we're taking care of each other. What does mutual aid look like within our organizations and institutions? So how do we work within the systems that we have to kind of shake things up, disrupt things, and recreate these boxes that we're living in, right? So I think there are ways to change from within, and we need to also be dismantling at the same time.
Yeah, I love that. It's like why I'm a harm reductionist all day, because I don't know that these institutions are going to be dismantled in my lifetime, right? But I'm thinking about the times I've had to navigate systems, or the times, I was doing harm reduction work and I had to support folks and be with folks navigating systems. And I always say there's always an underground railroad in these systems. And it's usually led by Black women who are like, oh, they told you no, baby, come over here, I got you, right? like let me show you how to get this thing that you need, because it's so much about relationships, right? So one of kind of the most heartbreaking thing about systems and institutions and nonprofits is there's all this like, we have to do things this way. And then when you like talk to the lawyer, you're like, actually, we don't have to do things this way. So those examples that you just named, Yashna, are so important. I also think because you can't talk about healing justice and not talk about disability justice, which means then confronting ableism and capitalism. Like, care costs money. Okay, so we need to just like be with that. Like, it's very expensive. It shouldn't be, it doesn't have to be, but in this context, it's very expensive to be taken care of and to take care of other people. And so some of the organizations that I work with that have really transformative policies around how they take care of their workers, they set that money aside, right? They're like, this is part of the budget. We're not backing down on this. It makes me think of the work of Free From. It's an organization that works with survivors. It's an economic justice organization. They just shared some of their policies on Instagram. And I was like, are you serious? Unlimited vacation time. Are you serious? Unlimited vacation time. Your benefits start on the first day. So again, these are things that are possible, but a lot of times folks don't do it because it's very costly, right? And as someone who's in the nonprofit industrial complex, how many times are people, having to write grants and people don't want to pay for general ops? I've had folks that want to donate to my org and they're like, we want to donate to this very specific program, but the labor of you as a Black genderqueer person we don't want to pay for that, right? So to just be inside of like, we do need to have the conversation around capitalism, because I think we end up talking around it and it's really not helpful.
Thank you for that, and I totally agree. I think one of the things that is always a hot and sticky topic, particularly in higher ed, is the budget and money and resources, and where that money and those resources go, in supporting our most vulnerable populations. Another key piece that I wanted to dig into, um, is this concept around intergenerational connections and community care. And one of the things that I have observed in higher education is what oftentimes can slow the work down or even stop the work, is these tensions between just intergenerational tensions, people having different perspectives on diversity and inclusion, or is it multiculturalism or is it social justice? Is it interculturalism or is it intersectionality? Right, all of these different concepts, or students having a set of language and ideas that is very different than maybe middle management or even folks in upper leadership. And so, how does intergenerational trauma benefit from healing justice? How can we talk about power, and encountering challenges and moving healing justice framework forward, particularly here at UMD, especially in light of having these different frameworks around doing the work and doing the work in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion? Who would like to take that on?
I'll go first. I really appreciate this question because I think there's no surprise that we do not have the same kinds of intergenerational spaces, right? So I'm thinking just specifically as a Black person and what has happened to my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation around mass incarceration, around the war on drugs, and how that really disconnected us from people who could help support and be that through line. And as someone who is no longer a young person, but like people still treat me like I'm 21, being this kind of middle space age-wise and generationally, I think is super important that we really sit and listen to each other. And I feel really grateful to have one of my primary teachers and mentors is a former political prisoner and Black Panther. And we have these intergenerational conversations and we struggle and we argue and we learn from each other, right? But we have to understand that the kind of context and conditions under which young people are making sense of the world, it is completely different than my generation and generations above me. And so I feel like it's hard to have patience with how we fumble together with these things because the needs are so urgent and we really need to get it together already. But I think there's a lot to be said for, like, specifically in institutions, history is cyclical, right? So, and when I think about studying the work of the Panthers, studying the work of the American Indian movement, I'm like, okay, what can we learn from what they struggled with? What's similar, what's completely different, what can we adapt, what do we have to completely make new? But that's because I was politicized in the context of history, right? Where my mentors were like, no, I'm going to tell you what was happening during the 40s and then before that, right? But we don't have intergenerational spaces to really grapple with these things together and to also learn from the ideas that I had 20 years ago. Some of those are not cute now. They don't work. They're problematic, actually. So we have to be willing to be transformed through the work as well.
Yes, I so love and appreciate that. And I feel like growing up in the South, um, I feel like that was part of the fabric uh, of life is intergeneration and being an immigrant as well, intergenerationality and like learning from multiple generations, both those that came before and those that are coming after. So I appreciate that so much. I wanted to answer the question in a slightly different angle of how does intergenerational trauma benefit from healing justice. What I hear from that is one of the greatest lessons I've learned from healing justice is that if there's intergenerational trauma, there's also intergenerational healing and resilience, and that both things exist at the same time, right? So if we've had trauma, we've also had healing, and those who have come before and those who are coming next have a knowing of those practices within them. And so I think it's about dividing, maybe it's not about dividing, right? Dividing our attention or sharing our attention to both things of how is trauma formed and rooted. And as Erica said before, it's by design from these systems are by design to traumatize us. And then what are the healing practices that have already come? What are the answers and that have already come to help us get through these types of moments?
Thank you. Another thing that, and I think likely the country, but I'll focus on UMD is grappling with is, how do we incorporate healing justice or the ideals, the framework of healing justice into our anti-racist efforts. That is another, kind of topic and term that is being used a lot now around anti-racism, and even honing in on anti-Blackness, and some of the tensions that have been happening on campus and the realities that have been happening on campus. And so, what are you all's thoughts around incorporating healing justice into anti-racist efforts, and even exploring, how can we focus in, or these connections on anti-Blackness as well?
Okay, Dr. Bailey, you just have all of the hard questions. I'm like, I don't know. I have no idea. I have more questions about that than answers. And I think,
yeah,
I spend a lot of time thinking about how we are really trying to grapple with white supremacy in these moments and in these times. And actually, like the emotional and spiritual work that we're asking people to do at their job and at school, and just the contradiction inside of that. It's like, we want racial justice. Okay, so that means literally we have to have the skills and safety and access to healing to manage what comes up inside of this work. And when we're specifically talking about anti-Blackness, to ask Black folks to engage in that work, it's just so much risk involved, and people often aren't tracking that. So I think what healing justice really can bring to those spaces and that work is just the reminder that we are emotional beings. We're in a body, we're having a spiritual experience, and if we're going to ask people to take that level of risk, then we better make sure that we're protecting people. We better make sure that we are moving towards safety, because there is no safe space, at least not on this planet that I'm aware of for me. But we can be building a culture where we are increasing safety or maintaining the safety that we have, but not like actively decreasing safety. And I think there's a piece around pacing that feels really important. Because when I think about healing justice, and I think about even my own personal healing work and the healing crises that have brought me to my knees, there is this piece around sometimes we're forging ahead, but we don't actually have the tools and the resources and the relationships to move as quickly as we're moving. So how do we balance these demands, right? That institutions really grapple with white supremacy yesterday, and also what does it mean to be a human who's impacted by these systems, trying to do that at work, at school. It's amazing. I think it's an amazing contradiction that we have to move with. But in the work that I'm seeing, I'm like, okay, when we can really tend to what's happening emotionally and spiritually and what's happening in the body as we are trying to grapple with these things, I think healing justice gives us a lot of strategies to tend to those things.
Thank you for that. I think what comes to mind for me is as a non-Black person of color, as an immigrant, really taking on the call to action to fight anti-Black racism and to do that healing work within ourselves and in our communities, so that it doesn't fall just on the Black community that has really led the way for people of color liberation in this country and around the world. And so I'm thinking also in institutions like a university, there's already organizations. Like I was part of a South Asian community in my university, and you're already self-organized. So how do you use those spaces not just to it's such a beautiful space to tap into your own cultural lineages, but how do you make racial justice a part of your cultural lineage, and how do you like take on this mantle and take on this fight? So that would be my call to action, and that yes, that it's both healing, that my healing justice lineage that I come from is deeply informed by racial justice, and so how do we make sure those stay connected in relationship with each other? And that I know that there's work happening around like decolonizing yoga and things like that. That's part of healing justice work, and yes, that's important. And when lives are at stake, like where do we want to put our attention and energy? And again, just a call to action there.
Yeah, I definitely so appreciate that in terms of the call to action. And one last question, and then we're going to go into, because there's a lot of questions coming in from the audience. And so, what resources or strategies would you all recommend to somebody who is just starting to explore healing justice in their lives? What is the starting place for them?
Kindred. I'm just gonna say Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. Their website is beautiful, and they're doing a lot of archiving, which is to me so important. Our network is relatively new to the healing justice conversation, and so we take our cues from folks who've been in this conversation, like Yashna, for a long time, and really see part of our role as making sure that we do not erase that lineage, because it's so important. And I think that there are other folks who are doing really interesting work around healing justice that are in relationship to Kindred, but I'm like, start at the source. And then there's like a ton of books that I'm happy to share as like an after thing, that have really helped to shape how I think about this work too.
Yes, Kindred, cannot say it enough. I agree about that. Thank you for that lineage of work. And political education, we've been saying it at different moments, that doing partnering your healing justice learning with political education is so important. There's the Political Education Center in the Bay Area that has a lot of great resources online. But to just to partner that work, the healing justice and political education work.
Thank you all so much for the knowledge that you all have been able to share in this moment. We are going to switch to Q&A from the audience. So I am going to start with this first question here. Erica, like you mentioned, I think many of us have held views in the past that are problematic. And at this point in time, those views were often posted on social media. How can we be accountable in a way that respects the trauma we may have caused and the healing that may have occurred since then?
That's such a beautiful question. Yeah, I mean, social media is hard. There's not too much healing that I've seen happening around these things. I think for myself, especially as someone who is a recovering perfectionist, I'm really hard on myself I'm like terrible to myself sometimes, but it's been really important for me to be in a community of people who are also in a practice around self-accountability, right? And to also recognize some of it's about trauma and some of it's about, you know, the things that I'm thinking about that I've continued to struggle with are around internalized ableism. And that's by design. Like, we live in a world that is rooted in ableism. So it's daily work. It's daily work to be accountable to not being complicit in that structural violence. But I think it's been really important for me to have a council of people who hold me accountable. And sometimes we think love and care and community is just showing up for people and not being like, what are you doing? Like, you're not in alignment with your values. And so I've done a lot of work over the past 5 years to really build the intimacy in my relationships and people that I'll go to who I'm like, please call me out and in, you know, like we have enough love where if you need to call me out, that's okay because we have relationship, but that accountability really requires relationship. And I think this is kind of the beautiful question because it just illuminates the overlap and weaving between transformative justice and healing justice. And a lot of times we're trying to engage kind of in this public discourse. And my most transformative accountability has happened in my most intimate friendships, right? In my family relationships where we can be vulnerable and honest, and also in my therapy sessions, right? And in other healing containers. So we can honor our trauma, but all of my healing from trauma has required accountability. And it's actually been, the accountability pillar has been the thing that like got me to the other side.
Yes, yes. And something, Erica, that you said earlier, I want to lift up, which is this like questioning around pace, which is also the fast pace is rooted in ableism and white supremacy. And if we're talking about social media and online spaces, that moves, you know, way faster than humans are built to move in terms of our thinking selves, our feeling selves. And so I would say just check pace and slow it down, that not everything needs to be immediate, not everything needs to be online. Um, and and but transparency is valuable. So one example I wanted to lift up was BYP 100, the Black Youth Project 100, a few years ago had a transformative justice process, and on their website or their blog, they months later posted a report back, and they didn't have the answers, but they said, this is what happened, and here's what we've learned from it, and we're not all the way through it. And so I think that's also valuable to learn from, of that, yes, transparency is important, but it doesn't always have to be immediate, and really to slow down and move at the pace of trust and love. As many leaders have said, what does that actually look like?
Thank you all so much. This next question is about, you know, how can healing justice be brought into hostile environments like the military, industrial complex, funded and hosted research, and generally majority white spaces and institutions? Can this be done from a position for or of limited or no institutional power, or within a marginalized identity?
So this question, it had my brain spinning, which I love that. Unpopular answer. So if healing justice is a political and spiritual strategy that is about building power and transforming intergenerational trauma, if you can figure out how to do that in an institution like the military industrial, like these things you're describing, if you can figure out how to do that, I won't say it's not possible. Okay. When my ancestors have survived, that's impossible. And they did it. I think what I've seen burn people out very quickly is try to bring healing justice inside of spaces where they have not accurately mapped the context and conditions, right? And so people are coming up with strategy that's not rooted in an accurate assessment. So if you're coming at this from organizing, right? An organizing strategy, then you would need to have a lot of things set up to integrate HJ into spaces where there's that kind of power differential. And when institutions have those kinds of power differentials, they're not trying to give them up. Even if there's the appearance of, oh, okay, well, now we have more people of color, now we have more queer and trans people. That's representation shenanigans. So I would say, I don't even know why would it be useful to even integrate things into that space. What I have seen happen for folks who are working in institutions that are really hostile and violent is folks building connections, relationship, trust, safety, and power externally as a way to support the reform work they're doing inside. And I think that's a beautiful strategy, because when you have that one person who's pushing for change, they're going to get burnt out, they're going to get worn out, they're also going to get targeted for their views. And so when we can take risk and be like, I got your back, even if I'm in a whole other institution, or even if I'm just someone who's in your family or community, we can actually build more power even outside of that space. But I'm super curious, Yoshina, what do you think about this one?
I so appreciated your answer, and bringing it back to power building and the collective force for change, I think is so important. This question, what it made me think of immediately was how yoga is taught in jails and prisons, how yoga is taught in militaries, specifically the Prime Minister of India right now, Modi, who is India's Trump, basically white supremacist, though Indian, white supremacist, Brahminical, dominant force, Hindu nationalist, is, you know, celebrated for bringing yoga into India's military. Just because, and this is what I was talking about, it's an add-on. It's something that's like, let me take this beautiful healing tradition, strip it of its connections to true liberation, to true justice, and insert it into this institution that is essentially about destruction, and is celebrated for that. But it doesn't work at the level of power and transformative change. Where I do see, I'm not saying we shouldn't do yoga in institutions and schools, but that if it's separated from the context of healing justice, is separated from the context of liberation, then it can only do so much. And yes, it may transform one or two people who then might be able to disrupt a system from the inside, which great, let's keep that happening. Again, I think we need reformists and revolutionaries. We need people to chip away from the inside, but to really change the structure system, we need a larger scale power building, as Erica mentioned.
Thank you all. Oh, go ahead, Erica, please.
I want to add one more thing, because I feel like it's like embedded in what we're saying. Healing justice is not going to fix everything. It's a very specific strategy to deal with specific kinds of trauma and crisis and distress, right? And grief and burnout. Sometimes folks come to me and they ask for healing justice, and what they need is transformative justice. And so I just want to like help to manage expectations, which is there are a lot of things that healing justice is just not fitting to do for us, right? It can do so many beautiful things, but sometimes it's not the right strategy for what we're trying to address, which is why I love that the lineage, it's so deeply rooted in all of these other movements and liberatory frameworks that we can move towards, because sometimes healing justice is not going to be it. You know, and a hostile environment, probably not the place I want to be opening up about my trauma. You know, I wouldn't encourage that.
Yeah, that segues into like my next question, just about, you know, and to talk about this kind of representation shenanigans that happens, and we see it in higher ed very well, right? Where it's like, well, we're just going to hire this person, or we have, you know, X amount of folks of color who might be in leadership. So, you know, what does it healing justice look like within groups, right? When we're looking at specific groups, that either might be like managers or student organizations, like, when we're looking at specific organizations and groups, what might this look like? Or, as you're saying, it might not even be the strategy, for a particular group to move through if they're not willing to dismantle that power. Does that question make sense?
Go ahead.
It's a good question, and I think we're chewing on it because it's an unanswered question, right? I think we're still figuring it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or what would
I
we
think,
want it to look like,
right. What would we want it to look like? That's great. And I think one thing that comes to mind is I've been part of trainings with generative somatics for the last over a decade, and I've been in teacher training for the last 5 years. And for those who don't know, generative somatics is a politicized somatics that works with social movements to bring things like healing justice, transformative justice, and collective change at multiple levels. And so what I've seen is that even within a politicized somatics, that training rooms really respond to the teachers and who look like them, who have had life experiences like them, who reflect them, right? So that even in healing justice, how do we keep reflecting our communities? Again, it's just another question.
Yeah, this question actually made me think about a story that Eddie Conway, my mentor, shared with me. He was incarcerated for 44 years, and I think it was in the 70s or the 80s, he was organizing inside because all the corrections officers were white. And he was organizing to have that representation, to have the COs be Black. And one of the things that he talks really openly about was like, that was actually the wrong move. Like this assumption that, oh, if a Black person's in this role, they're gonna inherently be more just or more in solidarity with me, right? Because it's not about individuals, it's about structures and systems. And the other piece that I really appreciate about healing justice is it's about a set of values, right? It's about a set of values. And just because you're from a community does not mean that you're rooted in a set of liberatory values, right? And I think that's some of what we're grappling with in this moment, especially if we're talking about anti-racism. The organizations I'm working with that are doing racial justice work, that's really beautiful and liberatory. It's like, what does it look like to work with the Black folks on staff around like how we internalized anti-Blackness and how are we out here throwing each other under the bus, right? What does it look like for non-Black folks of color to have that same conversation with, without the gaze of other people? And so we really have to complicate and nuance what we mean around these things, because we've already learned plenty of lessons that just having people from our community isn't enough. And I say this as someone who started a network for queer and trans therapists of color, because we do need people who are from our community. But what we've done for the past 5 years is build relationship and actually bring people into healing justice as a set of values and offer that as a framework to organize around, right? And there are people who are probably choosing not to be in our network because the way we do the work, we're unapologetically politicized. So, and that's okay. Like, it is okay if people are like, y'all are doing too much. I'm just trying to be a regular therapist. But if we don't have those more nuanced conversations, then again, 10 years from now, y'all are going to be on the panel like, we told y'all, don't just have more people of color up in the mix, And I think that becomes really challenging in multiracial spaces, Because if you're centering folks who are most impacted by white supremacy, there's this kind of hands-off approach that I see happen in institutions where it's like, well, this person is Black, so therefore they must know everything about the Black people, and they must know about strategy, and they must have it all figured out. And it's like, that we're human beings. How do I have it all figured out? How do I have it all figured out when I'm navigating white supremacy and queer and transphobia and capitalism every day? Like, we're all learning. So I think, again, I'm like, look at the models in history of like political movements where folks across race have been in solidarity with each other. I'm thinking about the Rainbow Coalition and Fred Hampton. I'm like, not to glorify everything from the past, but even currently we have examples of what it really means to show up for each other and see how these threads around violence and oppression impact us all, but in different ways.
Yeah. Thank y'all so much. I really appreciate everything that you all have shared. I appreciate being in community. Even sitting, here with you all has been healing for me. So thank you all for showing up and imparting so much wisdom and knowledge on us. I am going to invite Jasmine to come back on to wrap us up. But I will also just continue to say thank you, and much appreciation to our panelists and everybody who's been a part of organizing this event.
Thank you for that, Van, and thank you to both of our panelists. You both have given us so much to think about, so much to digest, so many gems that we'll be sitting with for days and weeks to come. This is the final program for the anti-racism toolkit that we've been doing this year, but we will certainly continue to do our anti-racism programming virtually and in other ways as we continue to move on and develop. So please, folks, please keep posted, follow us on social media and our Instagram and our newsletter to learn about upcoming events. We will be sharing Erica and Yashna's social media handles so that folks can follow them and continue to engage their work. And we will see folks in future sessions and programs. So thank you all. Have a blessed and wonderful week. And we'll be back at this again. Take care.